So we should be rocking and rolling now. So let me slide out of the way so we can get a depiction of what we're discussing today. I don't know why my screen just went dark, but there we go. That's besides the point. So we've already discussed how where lymph comes from. So we're good. We should be pretty good on that. If we're not, you can always ask me to expand further, and I will, of course. So now we're discussing the next step. I'd rather take the system step by step so it makes more sense. Instead of just going this system or this compartment, this compartment, this compartment, and then it doesn't really get you a great idea of how the system actually works. Because I could tell you, okay, the lymph capillaries are the things that capture the lymph, not capture, but the thing that lymph enters, and then it's transported through the lymphatic system, cleansed, and then re-enter back into the blood. Like, you could memorize that, yeah, but you don't really know what that means, and neither would I. So that's why we're taking it step by step, so we can actually understand the system and its function. Knowing the function is different than understanding. Memorizing something is oftentimes different than understanding. So I'd want us to be able to understand what we're discussing also. So we already know where lymph comes from, lymph being the mostly plasma. It's other materials as well, but mostly plasma. From the blood capillaries and blood vessels, right? So we'll first talk about where the lymphatic the lymphatic capillaries are oriented, right? So we have we have our blood vessels and our blood capillaries that are connected to one another, kind of like this, right? Our lymphatic capillaries and vessels actually reside in the spaces between those, which is where your cells reside as well, and that's where that interstitial fluid, which is just supposed to be this depiction here, but that's where that interstitial fluid actually leaks out at as well. So that's how they're able to suck that up. So to give you a great depiction of that, which it isn't a great depiction, but to give you a depiction of that, your lymphatic vessels and capillaries are not connected to your blood vessels and blood capillaries. Your lymphatic vessels and lymphatic capillaries are perpendicular or adjacent to, meaning they just simply reside next to them. They are not connected in any way whatsoever. Your lymphatic vessels and your lymphatic capillaries are solely responsible for lymph. Your blood vessels and blood capillaries are solely responsible for your blood. They are not connected to one another. Right. Okay, yeah. So we know that's how we got here. Blood pumps via the heart, which is that smooth tissue, with smooth contractile tissue. Blood pumps through an artery. Artery takes blood away from the heart, and it's getting transported. Oxygenated blood is being transported, which is that depiction back there, is being transported. And we do know that the I'm tired. Your blood capillaries actually have holes in them, which causes lymph to leak out of, which is plasma. Lymph is only plasma. It's a few other materials as well, but it's mostly plasma. Plasma simply means water-like, and plasma is important, and we'll discuss that later with the duct as well. But to give you a little insight on what we will be discussing, plasma is important, and the lymphatic system is important because plasma is needed to help with the viscosity of blood. When your blood loses plasma, it gets thicker. It makes it harder for your heart to pump thicker blood, which is why plasma needs to go through the lymphatic system and cleansed and then re-enter the bloodstream. If it doesn't, your blood becomes thicker and too hard to pump for your heart. So that's one of the most important things about the lymphatic system. So once more, your lymphatic vessels and lymphatic capillaries reside in the spaces between those blood capillaries and blood vessels, right? So we wonder, how does lymph actually enter your lymphatic capillaries? Well, they do so because of these, what we call oak leaf endothelial cells, which are basically just flap-like cells that are on the ends of your lymphatic capillaries. Your lymphatic capillaries are closed-ended, so they do not have an opening that will allow the fluid to just enter. Your oak leaf endothelial cells allow for lymph to enter the lymphatic capillaries, but not exit. To give you a better depiction of that, we have this here. My computer's trying to adjust to light for some reason, and it gets darker from time to time, so don't mind that. So these flaps here, these flaps that you're seeing are the oak leaf endothelial cells of the lymphatic capillaries. That excess interstitial fluid, that fluid between, which is basically the lymph that leaks between the cells, that fluid presses against these cells, which we'll call them flaps. It presses against these flaps. These flaps then in turn move. So let's say hypothetically if the fluid was entering or the fluid was pressing against, this space here would drop down, fluid would enter during that space, and then it would flap back up, which is why the fluid is unable to leak back out of your lymphatic capillary. Right? Okay, good. So, and to give you a better diagram of what I mean when I say they're adjacent to the blood capillaries and blood vessels, here, it's not a great example, but it kind of gives you a depiction that they aren't connected to, they reside in the spaces between your blood capillaries and your blood vessels. So that's how they're able to capture that lymph. Lymph leaks out from the holes in those blood capillaries and blood vessels, and they are picked up by your lymphatic capillaries and lymphatic vessels. We're only discussing the lymphatic vessel of capillaries at this point, at this moment. So that's how that process begins. So if we're ever wondering, how does lymph actually enter the system? We know it comes through the capillaries, but I don't know specifically how that works, and I'm not really understanding what an oak leaf endothelial cell is actually meant for. That's what it's meant for. That's its function, and that's how lymph begins in that lymphatic gets into and then enters the lymphatic system. Okay, so yeah, to recap what we've learned so far, we know that your heart pumps blood, which we should know that your heart pumps blood, and blood is carried away from your heart via the arteries. Your artery, the blood that is being carried away from the heart, has a connection to veins, which carry blood back to the heart, deoxygenated blood. So they have connections of blood vessels and blood capillaries, right, that remove or deoxygenate the blood. During that process, plasma leaks through the little holes that are in your blood vessels and blood capillaries. That plasma then enters the interstitial spaces, which are the spaces between your cells, right? And that fluid needs to be picked up by our lymphatic capillaries and vessels. If they don't, an excessive fluid can cause edema, which we discussed previously, which is tissue damage due to excess fluid. It can also cause things like elephantitis, which we discussed in the last video as well, which are people who have an excess of lymphatic fluid. And you may notice that they have bigger body parts, essentially. So someone with a very, very large leg, almost like an elephant's leg, that's actually where that comes from. So we've discussed that fluid resides in those interstitial spaces, and we need the ability to regulate the amount or balance the amount of fluid that we have, which is one of the many purposes of the lymphatic system. Once we're done explaining the system, we'll finish off by explaining its multitude of functions. So, yeah, and those holes that are in the blood vessels and blood capillaries are used for a multitude of things. One of those is an exchange of materials between your blood and the cells. Your cells need glucose in order to go through things like glycolysis, which helps with energy production. You can get that from the bloodstream via those holes that our plasma leaks from. So that's why you may be wondering, why is there holes there? Why don't we just close it up? That's why they're there. And our body created a workaround so our cells can still get what they need from the bloodstream, and we still don't pass away or have deformities due to an excess amount of interstitial fluid. So hopefully that made sense. Yeah, so that's it so far. The next video will go into the lymphatic vessels, and then your lymph nodes, and then your ducts, and then how that re-enters the bloodstream and why it re-enters the way it does. One thing I will leave you with before we go to the next video is that if we ever want to distinguish between our lymphatic capillaries and our lymphatic vessels, we can do so not only with their function, but with their size. Lymphatic vessels are thicker than lymphatic capillaries. And I'll show that depiction in the next video. But I'll leave you with that for the time being. Hopefully this was helpful as well.